Welcome to Conversations from the Yellow Chair. I'm Andrea Bryk, the owner and director of Waves of Harmony. And with me today is Greg Roberts, PhD, the owner and director of Grief and Trauma Support. To start this series of conversations from the Yellow Chair, we are here today to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our background and what brought us to the professions that we are in. So I'm a music therapist and Greg is a grief and trauma support counselor. And we thought it would be a good idea to reach out and record this for you. And the audience being professionals who might be interested in who we are in the space, or people who have an interest in therapy. So people who might be curious about, well, why would you become a therapist? And why would you become a counselor versus a music therapist in this case? So we thought it would be a good idea to record this conversation today to give you an idea of what brought us to our counseling and therapy roles. So, Greg, I'm really interested to hear your backstory first and what led you to do the work that you do. And could you just start by telling us about that?
Great. Thanks, Andrea. And it is very good to be having this conversation. And I know we're going to talk about how we got here to this conversation a little bit later. But my sort of backstory, in a bit of a nutshell, is becoming a therapist. When I think about that, sort of takes me back to my childhood in a way, because I recall sitting and having conversations with the family dog. So whenever I was, thinking about something or sometimes upset about something, I tend to sort of go off by myself and sit with the family dog, who would just sit in front of me and I could pat him and he seemed to just listen. So that unconditional attention, companionship, I guess, felt really important. And I didn't know it at the time, but if I look back now, that was probably the starting point of recognising what that felt like, to have someone give you attention and for it to be unconditional. But then if I sort of think a little bit from there, I left school when I was 15 and took up an apprenticeship as a potter, making pottery. And part of that training was very much in the Eastern Japanese sort of tradition.
Yep.
And so a lot of Eastern philosophy was talked about with regard to making pottery, and that fascinated me, like those ideas about life, and the making of pottery just sort of grabbed me a bit. And it took my attention enough that when I was around 18, I started practicing Tai Chi and learning Tai Chi. And again, that took me a bit further into a connection with the whole self, so the body and body awareness and the importance of that, and also connecting with other people, and further into those Eastern sort of philosophies and those ideas. And then a bit of a convergence started to happen where trying to earn a living being a potter became quite difficult, and I had to think about, how am I going to live life now, like how am I going to earn an income? And the logical progression to me seemed to be massage therapy. So
Yeah, right.
I trained as a massage therapist, and at the time I'd already started teaching Tai Chi. So those connections with people, and often at the end of class people would talk, and I noticed how I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Then as a massage therapist, similar, I noticed how, as well as the massage therapy itself, people would tell their stories about what was happening in their lives. And I found myself sort of almost naturally or drawn towards hearing those stories and interested in them. And then this weaving path sort of took me to eventually thinking about therapy and counselling, and I decided to return to university, having left school at 15 as a mature age student.
Very brave.
Yes, it felt very brave at the time. Like, what am I doing?
Quite a leap of faith, really.
Yeah. It was huge. And I thought a lot about what sort of study I wanted to do, and I came to social work as my degree that I studied because I realised I was interested in everything about a person, so particularly the context, not just their mind. And looking at psychology for me felt like it was a little bit more focused in that area, and I know there's social psychology and all of those things that I learnt about during my degree, but social work felt like a broader context. And then very quickly, you know, because through social work my thought always was of heading towards being a counsellor and a therapist, and I was lucky to do a social work degree where that was incorporated into the degree. So I guess professionally I'm mindful as I'm talking about it, that's sort of my work role, and then there are lots of life experiences in the background along the way that we might talk about today as we go along, but that's in a nutshell the path that sort of got me to where I am, and that heavy influence of connecting with someone else, what it feels like to have someone connect with you, and holding that as a really important aspect of therapy and counselling, because that's what I experienced way back with the family dog.
Yeah.
And then right through other experiences, noticing how I felt continually drawn to that sense of connection and how important it is with people. So that's a bit of a snapshot.
I think there's several things that I've pulled out of that already, which, and some of them I didn't even know about you. So this is a discussion that's fairly organic. We haven't scripted or really even talked about this with each other. So some of this information is actually a surprise for both of us.
Yes.
But I think what I've picked out of that is a couple of things. One is the really important and paramount importance on the connection between people that you've picked up so nicely on. And starting with the family dog, which is, I think lots of people actually have better relationships with animals than they do some of their family members. We've seen this in palliative care where we've both worked. When somebody dies, it's okay, but when the animal family dog dies, it's really upsetting.
Very upsetting.
It's a story in itself, but that therapeutic relationship is what we call it in our professional world, but it goes back to those relationships with people. And I think being drawn to people is really a core element of being a therapist or a good therapist, I'd say. And going back to that. So what I'm curious about, actually, if you could maybe talk a little bit more to this, is that it sounds like you had a really organic sort of adolescence into adulthood where you explored some different creative things like pottery, the Tai Chi. You know, I think of it more of it as an art form, the way that you're speaking about it, than a martial art or a fitness endeavor. So, and then deciding on going into a sort of a counseling role, you chose a really sort of structured certificate degree course. And I'm kind of wondering how you went from this sort of creative, sort of movable, organic space to this really structured. How did that occur to you, and how did that sit with you at the time?
That's honestly interesting, because as I was reflecting, thinking about our conversation, that came up as a reminder, because when I was at school, and part of the picture of me leaving school quite early was a couple of things. So socially at that time was finding school quite hard. Academically, I was quite good, and when I was planning to leave, teachers were trying to convince me to stay because they said, actually, we don't understand, you're doing really well in all your subjects. What's this about? part of it was social, but part of it was this feeling of what's the point of this stuff we're learning? Probably a typical teenager, I was thinking, how is this relevant to my life and living this stuff in textbooks and, having to go through these processes? Like, really? How much am I going to use this? And so I felt that need to get out and experience the world and just live. And I can recognise that's a theme, that yes, coming into the social work degree felt like a big thing because I was returning to that structure. It was hard to get back into a routine of studying, but even though I enjoyed it, there was always that questioning. And the bit that helped was that the chair of social work at Deakin University, where I studied, was a lady called Jan Fook, who all of our coursework had a lot of critical reflective practice. And so that helped because within the textbooks and the study, we were being asked to stop and question almost everything. Yeah. So that I was probably lucky. Maybe if I'd done a different degree, I may have pulled out of it. I don't know. But this, being able to reflect and question, really sat well with me. And it's continued that feeling of like weighing up the importance of study, professional practice, having a good professional background, as well as just being a human being and sort of questioning where's the space between the two. So I don't know if I've answered all of your question. And I'm also, I know you'll come to it in a moment, but I'm also interested to sort of hear a bit of your background as well in a little while. Because again, like you said, we haven't scripted this, so it'd be interesting to sort of hear, because there are resonances and synergies, I think, just in some of the conversations we've had.
Absolutely, Greg. And as you were speaking, it actually it was like, there were things that you said that really actually aligned with some of the things that have happened in my background as well. So I think to go back to the schooling, I hate to go back to this sort of chronological timeline of here's what I did and then I did this kind of thing. But I think in America, which is where I'm from, the USA, obviously, I was in a high school that was really college bound, focused, and everybody was going to school and doing their thing. And since I was in the 3rd grade, I knew I wanted to do music. I loved music class. I loved playing music. I played piano when I was a child. I played the clarinet, and I loved my clarinet. And I think through that real sort of doing music, it was my world. And in a way, the way you discovered sort of therapy through your dog, I discovered therapy through my clarinet. It was my space to be in my own place, in a safe place, in a place that was really pleasing to me, where I could express and where I could get my energy into it. So for me, it was a real doing space. It was a real place where I could go to do this. Music brought me life. It brought me energy, and it brought me everything, really, at that time in my life. And as you said, like teenagers, there's all sorts of rotten things going on for teenagers. So that was where I just took refuge, I think. And so for me, it actually felt natural to use music as a means to expression. And sort of like you, thinking, well, I actually had part of the animal aspect of what you talked about as well, because I really was thinking, well, when I go to school, I want to be a veterinarian. But the thing that sort of turned me off was the years of medical school, and that wasn't the way my brain worked. I definitely knew that I needed to be in a creative space rather than a sort of scientific space, if you will. Yeah. And so I think there was this sort of on the fence about, do I study music education or do I study music therapy in my year 12 or senior year of high school? And thinking about that path, it seemed logical to go to music teaching first, to sort of work with children and work with that energy work with sharing my knowledge of music, sharing my love of music, sharing my passion of music. And I had some really big influences that I really wanted to be this big director. I really wanted to take on the world. And as a female also, I felt that was a space that I pushed a little bit as well, wanting to be a successful female director of a group, of an ensemble, and that was the product of teaching these children how to play instruments. So I think for me it goes into the energy space of the music, and it goes into the space of wanting to work with people, and young people at that point in my life was the place where I put my focus. So I think that led to my undergraduate degree in teaching. And of course, like you, there's a winding road to the story, and somehow I knew that where I was and what I was doing wasn't the right place to be. That landing my dream job at age 25 and not feeling fulfilled and feeling a little bit like it didn't fit. And this is something we'll talk about later. If I would have had the wisdom I have today about feeling the sense in my body that it wasn't the right thing, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it as long as I did, or kept on that path as long as I did. But there's the part of the journey that led to me moving overseas and teaching some more and starting to actually get out of my comfort zone, which I think was a bit of a scary thing for me. And like you, taking some leaps of faith. So I think at that point overseas was the first time I really started feeling like I was tapping into some things that were therapeutic outside of music for myself, and learning more about, not just about the energy space, but more into the mind and the body and the spiritual space. And we'll talk about that actually as we segue into the next question, if we can, which is just about the influences that have come up. Certainly, like you had already mentioned in your social work degree, that there was somebody that prominent that actually shaped your learning and shaped your experience of learning. And that was definitely, even before I entered the degree to study music therapy, somehow randomly I picked up a book by Dr. Andrew Weil. And this was before the age of digital things, and I must have been in a bookstore and picked up 8 Weeks to Optimum Health. And this was the challenge, to actually incorporate mind, body, spirit into these 8 weeks of well-being. And of course I focused on the diet and the physical aspects, because that's what I was doing. And the spiritual aspects really sort of challenged me. And the mind-body connection that was introduced in that book was very introductory, but still something that I wasn't ready to really explore at that time. And I think, like many young people, we focus on the do. And I was really getting things done. I was really good at what I was doing and all those things, but I wasn't really paying attention so much to what was going on. So I think that was my first influence into this sort of holistic space, if you will. So I'm curious, before I talk about some other influences, about maybe your first introduction to the sort of holistic, that bringing that mind, body, spirit together.
And it's interesting hearing you talk about that. I don't want to completely lose that I noticed when you were, like, it really resonated when you were talking about the clarinet, which I didn't know that was such an important instrument for you when you were younger. But just the way your whole body came alive when you were even talking about that experience.
Yes, it does.
But something in what you were saying absolutely resonated with what I was saying about the connection with the family dog. You know, that felt like a safe place, felt like your place. You could just immerse yourself in that experience. It felt like that was the important part that was coming through.
Absolutely.
So influences for me, I feel like the other part, in a very different way, was music for me, and particularly both the sound of the music and its effect on me, but lyrics. So as a teenager, I felt a bit different to some of my peers because I tended to listen to a broad range of music, but I really like music. People like Jackson Browne, Don McLean, so lots of sort of lyrical and sitting and listening to that.
Yeah.
And immersing myself in that was another experience of, the effect, looking back now, on me and my body and how I felt. And picking up on what you were saying about mind, body and spirit, almost naturally because of Tai Chi, back when I was studying Tai Chi and teaching Tai Chi, it was considered quite new age.
Yeah. And I didn't want to use the words woo-woo.
No, but I was about to use them.
But really, that's what I was kind of getting at with you and this whole sort of space that was a bit like sort of this creative, organic, granola, lentil place, going to this real structured sort of titled, registered space. For me, it seems like, it's quite a change.
Yeah, it was quite a change. So there was a lot of... as well as practicing Tai Chi, I would go off to workshops on meditation. As you were talking, it's like, first coming across people like Louise Hay and reading her books. And again, thinking about sort of mind, body, spirit, the environment, all of those things. And at that younger age, sort of feeling really fascinated by those things. But also like there was something a bit bigger that I didn't fully understand. And I think that perhaps was part of the pathway into studying, was maybe realising that knowledge was important, and tapping into other people's knowledge and what they had to say could actually help me form my own sense of things. Whereas when I was younger, I think that pushing against the establishment and structure in schools and that sort of stuff, realising actually there are ways out there to gather knowledge that could actually be quite useful. So I guess influences, I've already mentioned, like that background that might be seen as a bit woo-woo, that's certainly there. But my Tai Chi master was a huge influence of just embodying a lot of those Eastern philosophies, but particularly Taoism, in how he taught us Tai Chi and sent us off to read stuff. So reading the Tao Te Ching and things like that, which completely I had no idea at that age, like I was in my 20s, but still felt fascinated and wanted to read more and learn more about that. And then through massage therapy and coming into social work, probably that first key influence was someone like, as well as my lecturers, but Jan Fook and that critical reflective practice. It really fascinated me, this idea of not just going about things and thinking that you know something, but actually stopping and thinking about, okay, how do I know that? What makes me think that I know that? And a bit like we're doing, like what are the things influencing me knowing that? And what will it mean if I share that with someone else who probably has a different experience and perspective? So started to really sort of get my mind quite active and that knowledge base of wanting to understand that. And
it sounds like that very early on you had this experience of already kind of picking up on some of these really sort of big concepts in therapy, and that you were already looking through a lens that was already quite advanced at that stage, really. For a young person, you're already sort of taking that into your space, and you'd kind of easily, well, maybe not easily, but had gone through those steps to progressed into that space.
And it's almost, as I'm talking, it's realising that yes, those things were there, but I didn't really feel like I understood what I was immersing myself in. Like I loved it and immersed myself, but it's like I don't quite... I couldn't quite assimilate it all into something a bit more concrete.
That actually makes me feel better, because I'm thinking about my own story and thinking, boy, when I was sort of in these phases of like going through the music therapy program, and it was a very experiential program. So again, the music was the energy, and trying to do even relaxation sessions together with my classmates was still really doing things. And it was a reflective space for sure. Music therapists are extremely reflective, and I think that fit with me. And I think that perhaps I thought I was doing all these things, but I think in a way it was sort of like, fake it till you make it. I thought I was doing these things, but now that I look back, I don't think I really was. I had that sense of, oh yeah, I'm really in this. You think you know everything when you're in your 30s. I think that's the moral of the story.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I struggled a lot. I've done 2 overseas moves. I had some things that were happening for me in my own space that I knew I wanted to make changes with. So I grabbed onto some psychological sort of hinges at that point in my life and looked to psychology. I think I went sort of way on the deep end and started, like you, sort of reading a lot into this, trying to actually experience EMDR myself, and doing some real sort of deep therapeutic work in my own space first, to sort of understand it and realize how amazing and how transformative it was for me. I think the experience itself was something that I think I grabbed onto before the actual concept or conceptual things landed in my space. And even to this day, I think experiencing things for me is a better way for me to actually be able to teach and use those methods in my own therapy, if you will.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I wanted to sort of, like I was really interested when I first started working in palliative care with Dr. Michael Yapko, and really sort of a really hard, psychological, looking at relaxation and focusing in his meditations and looking at those things and thinking, yeah, this is really good stuff. And he really boiled down psychology for me, like that people really do. It's not like everybody's a mystery, that there are certain things that actually we can look at and go, oh yeah, well that's kind of what we say is like textbook behavior, and sure there's outliers and sure there's nuances within that. But I think that really was sort of a relief to me that I was actually sort of a textbook case, that I wasn't alone in my sort of what you would call my trauma story. Everybody has some sort of traumas in their lives, right? Whatever they are. And I think that was really important for me to sort of kind of find that hinge. And I think, like a lot of therapists, young therapists do, I think I went like looking around, sort of like a hammer looking for things to bang on when they didn't need it, and sort of taking that approach everywhere. And look, I think we go through these stages as therapists as well, but certainly the psychological gurus were some of the people that I looked to early on.
And I feel like I'm hearing that Michael Yapko, because he was able to distill things down, and it's really interesting, it's something I didn't know, but I hadn't heard of Michael Yapko, but when I was having some therapy for myself, the psychologist I was seeing printed out a couple of chapters out of Michael Yapko's books, and I can understand what you're saying. There's something about his way of writing and distilling things that made it easier to grasp, and there was something fairly human about the way he wrote about depression and anxiety and things like that. And I think those were big ones for me, like thinking about depression and anxiety and them being close cousins and those things, and it being really straightforward, and it being really about sort of defining these terms in a really useful way for me, I think. And that's and I'm going to go back a second and just clarify that I looked to that psychology because I think I did feel like, and to all the music therapists out there, you can shoot me down or comment, but I felt like psychology was a little bit low in our training, and I felt like that was a space I was interested in, first of all, but also that I felt working in the population I was working with in palliative care, I felt I needed more of that in my toolbox to actually serve the clients I was working with at the time. So I think that was part of that, the way that tangent sort of came about, and my interest in it. Yeah. And it's interesting because I know, again, this is probably part of our introduction, and we might come back to it, but there's something in what you're saying that's making me think about, as we're sharing our background and our influences, there's something about being able to experience something and feel like you have a sense of something and it being useful. But then doing this sort of work, there's also then how you explain what you're doing.
Exactly.
And articulate it.
Yeah.
And that's, I can hear for both of us, finding ways to do that, to both know something, experience something, embody something, but then if you're trying to take it to someone else, how do you explain that or articulate it, and us having experiences of other people doing that for us and us being able to go, oh, okay, that makes sense, or I can hear that now, or that drops into place.
Yeah. And it's funny as you're talking to me that I'm also going to add to that timing is everything. Because funny story, when I was in my younger years, when I was going through my music therapy program, and I just moved to Australia, and life was really confusing and tough. And I was seeing a psychologist at the time who introduced me to mindfulness. And I was like, oh my God, that is so stupid. Like, why would I do that? Why would I just let something be?
Yeah.
I walked out of that door and didn't come back to that psychologist. And it took me probably, I want to say almost 10 years. Because I thought I knew everything.
I know, that's quite a confession.
It's quite a confession, but I was not into it.
Yeah.
And I was in this situation where I could attend a workshop. And it was a palliative care workshop. And the speaker was Craig Hassad from Monash University. And he started talking about his swimming experience. And in high school, I was a competitive swimmer. And oh boy, I grasped onto that because I was like training for Ironmans. And I was this real fitness, kind of person. Talk about like I really was a doer. I was like just my body, I was physically really smashing it out. And this guy talking about competitive swimming, oh wow. I was on the edge of my seat just listening, and then he dropped the mindfulness bomb right there. And talked about how he used mindfulness to be a better swimmer. And I grasped right onto mindfulness. Sung its praises, lived it, felt it, believed in it like nobody's business.
Is that to do with something in what he was saying? I'm just wondering whether that you recognise that perhaps in that competitive swimming, in a way, you were doing some mindfulness back then, but you hadn't recognised what it was.
Well,
by focusing and...
You know what? Like we talked about, we're trying to like sort of name drop our influences, and I think really sort of this is an unusual connection, but I think something that was happening through this training, and I'd moved to Australia, truth be told, not just for the course, but for this man that I loved. And he actually was really into martial arts. And I was into, the sort of the more individual sort of training, the Ironman and the running and the swimming and all that. But when I was studying music therapy and as I was working in palliative care and bringing in this new psychological knowledge and mindfulness, it's starting to tap into these spaces that were a little bit more about mind and body. And remember that I did have those influences through Andrea a while back. And I started actually letting the spiritual aspects and the mind-body connection start trickling in. But what would happen is I'd be talking about something therapeutically, and he would be like, oh yeah, we do that all the time in martial arts when we fight. Yeah. Or in army when we prepare to shoot a gun, we have to get in a mindful state. And we would be comparing notes, and it was so unusual. But such an influence came out of that to realize that mindfulness could be used in so many ways.
Yes.
And that we're probably practicing mindfulness unknowingly in a lot of spaces in our lives. Yeah. So that was very sort of enlightening conversations that we'd have about these sort of parallels from, real sort of sort of a fighting space, if you will,
Yeah.
and on the contrary, in a therapeutic space, trying to help people.
Yeah.
And how they were actually the exact same process.
Yes.
Fascinating. So these were, and again, really just sort of interesting. Yeah, sort of things to stumble on. So I thought I'd mention that because sometimes we go looking for something and I think we close ourselves off to the bigger picture of how things fit into it or how it could be applied or where we could draw from even.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're making me think about like another influence that's been particular over the last probably about 12 years or so for me is connecting in with the world of focusing oriented therapy and the work of Eugene Gendlin. A bit like you're saying, like when I first came across that, I noticed how there were parts of me felt like I recognised something.
Yeah.
And there were little bits out of Tai Chi practice, there was parts out of my interest in philosophy and existentialism that had come as part of doing my social work degree where I took electives in philosophy, like every elective was in philosophy because I was fascinated. But coming to focusing, it's different but similar to what you're saying about mindfulness for you. It was like this feeling of my body and my whole being knows something about this.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that I knew something about this. But then landed with it, and even now, the more I learn about it and think about sort of being in that way, it's like there's so much of my background sort of weaves in and out around the feeling of that. And I felt a bit silly in a way when someone first mentioned focusing, because I heard someone talking about it and then I realised they were talking about a particular something that had a connection into the counselling and therapy world.
Yeah.
But I was sitting there going, I don't know anything about that. I've never heard of focusing. Like, what is this? And it sounded a bit like some sort of weird type of approach, and I'm trying to work out, what is this? But then when I sort of read a bit about it and then started learning about it, it's like it really landed in me and felt familiar. And it sounds like a bit of that was the case, like with mindfulness and those sort of practices. It's like, oh yeah, I sort of do know this.
Yeah, and I think, look, something that I think, I'm going to put this out there, and I think that it's important. I've already mentioned a couple of times that I've had my own experience with therapy, and I think that that's really important to recognize that a lot of therapists are actually sort of like the wounded healers. We walk around and we do want to help people. I knew I wanted to help people. I knew I went into music therapy because music teaching was great, but I wanted to be of more service was the words I used. And even now I think about every person that walks through my doors, and I think they all come in with their own stories, and I've had my own stories, and it's about sharing things that not only I've learned, but that I've experienced that possibly could land in a space that they, like you, what is that? And just sort of sounds like something interesting, sounds like something unusual even, and that's what I think starts helping us grab onto it. But the other point I wanted to make was that sometimes it's, and look, the Japanese have a saying for this, I can't remember the words, but it's about learning through going through hard times. We go through these hard times in our life, and I've had a couple of gigantic health scares, and a lot of people can relate to that, how that really sort of makes you sit back and do that reflection and go into that reflective space. I think that experiencing focusing came about, you had introduced it to me, because you'd written about it in your PhD, and I was interested in what you had to say, and this was sort of our connection, was the space, the academic space at that time. And that whole idea of focusing was another one where I went, this was like something that came about in the 1980s. This is so way on the, like, way too old. There's certainly better stuff out there. I was really critical, and being in that academic space, I was like looking through everything and reviewing it like I was, going through. And what I didn't realize at the time, and by the way, I quit my PhD because I think that the space that I'm in actually allows to look at things like it doesn't have to be less than 5 years old to actually be valuable.
No.
And we know this back from, Ayurveda, and we know this back from Chinese medicine. And we know that these systems have been around for thousands of years.
Yes.
And some of this woo-woo stuff, or pseudoscience, as we call it, sometimes it has its value.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to put myself out there and say that because I think that sometimes people will find value in it and be attracted to that space. So I think the focusing place, when I tried it the first time, I was very cynical and I said, well, but I'm going to be fair, and if I'm going to be dismissive of it, I have to actually say that it doesn't work. So I sat down in my chair and had the focusing, and I listened to it, and I did the process, and I came out of it and I went, whoa, that actually works. And it actually shifted something major right there and then. So I think, again, it's that whole thing of calling the bluff.
Yes. Yeah.
And having those experiences. So going back to that, the point is that I think going through some of those, going through the hard spaces, going through the hard times in our life brings us to the place of learning more and reaping more information, reaping more resources, looking for something even further outside what we know.
I think so. And some of what you're saying, when we think about what we call science-based or evidence-based these days, even the word research is interesting to me because like the origins of the word are really about like going back and taking another look, and that can be around absolutely anything. And so some of the things that are out there that I think are really important and helpful for people, some people might say, oh, that doesn't have an evidence base or it's not scientific, but it's then questioning, well, what are we actually calling scientific?
Yeah.
What are we calling evidence?
Yeah. And perhaps this is a topic for another conversation because I think we could really pick that apart and unpack what that means. And of course, like I know you've completed your PhD, but I didn't. And one of the reasons I think I didn't is because I don't think that what I was looking for had enough of an evidence base to begin with, which is why I was doing trying to do the research to begin with and getting kind of a catch-22 situation going on. So that I think, would it be fair if we moved on from the space? So I think we've looked at some of the influences and our backgrounds and how we came to music therapy, myself, and how you've come to a little bit of how you've come to grief and trauma therapy, perhaps in these spaces. I guess what I'd like to move into is just sharing with our audience about how we landed here today. And why we're sharing this and why we have other topics lined up already that we want to share with the greater community. And I think you can talk a little bit about our background together. Yeah.
So I seem to recall we first met when I was coming to the palliative care service that you were working for and offering like monthly supervision, I think would have been the first time we met. And I'm probably remembering this wrong, I don't know, but I seem to remember you talking to me or approaching me about supervision and interested in how it might be useful having that sort of grief and bereavement sort of lens to the supervision, because that's sort of the background of the work that I've been doing. And so that was our first connection. And then I ended up a few years later working at that service. So we worked together. And then it just seemed I can't remember a point where we went, right, we've got this connection. But it sort of evolved into, because we had been and are a little bit now like living not that far from each other, it became, oh, why don't we catch up? We both like walking, why don't we catch up and go for a walk and a chat?
I actually remember the moment it happened. It was a walk with Greg, and I was doing my PhD, and I needed somebody to do some scoping review sorting with me, some legwork. And if anybody knows what goes into a scoping review, believe me, you wouldn't want to do one, but it was on my list of things to do at that point. And I asked Greg, would you be so kind to join me in this scoping review? I think you have a similar lens of things that I'm looking for, and not necessarily that you want that in a scoping review, but I felt like you would be a good reviewer, and also you'd be able to contribute to that idea of holism. What I was studying was holism and palliative care at the time.
And as you say that, I do remember that was a point of connection because you were focusing on holism. And I think our conversation, like my interest in that idea of what is holism and holistic and all of that, sort of forged that connection between us.
Absolutely.
And it's just really and that more, I guess, the bridge of having a connection professionally and just interest-wise and going for walks, but then doing that scoping review, bit like we talked about, for me and for you probably separately, like coming back to a structured knowledge base and trying to work within that while thinking about holism and the human experience and how to navigate.
It was very disconnected, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, talk about trauma. I have some trauma. I think I have some trauma from that PhD experience, but thinking about how they didn't align, how the researching and yet the concepts and it didn't seem to align. It was really hard to put into words.
Yeah.
And I think after we published the article that was really quite critical on how holism is presented in palliative care, and we felt pretty good about that because we felt it was a pretty accurate picture of what was happening. And I think from then we kind of drifted a bit and went our separate ways and recently came back to sort of what I would call the 3-hour coffee chat. And sort of sitting over coffee and just realizing that we still had all these interests and yet no place to really air all this knowledge and all this experience that we have in speaking about holism and what we've learned. So these talks were inspired by that coffee conversation of why don't we just share with people and hopefully there's some meaningful content here that you'll take away. And thinking about, how holism fits into our practice as therapists. And when we present, we may talk about holism specifically, but we might just talk about aspects of that mind, body, spiritual connection in the different topics that we choose. And to be clear that it's a platform pretty much for us to share and hopefully discuss with people, that we're not looking to say something definitively, which I think that was the problem with the research, was I wasn't looking to say something and come to a conclusion, if you will, but it's more of just opening up the space to look for people's comments about that and happy for you to actually question and be critical with what's being said here, because I think, again, everything has a place, everything we're allowing for that.
And I think you're just reminding me, coming into having this conversation today and thinking of what I would share, realising that probably we'll look back at this video and some of my perspectives, different things will come up of how it keeps changing and evolving as we go along. So I think there is, through our conversation, like this being a platform that has an openness, and it's sharing what's taking our attention at the time, and it's not saying it's the thing or the only thing. And
also, maybe like myself, maybe you're feeling like even through this conversation, there's a million other things happening in my mind that I'd love to bring in, but in the interest of time and focusing of this video, that we're not going to go into those spaces for right now. So I think there's always that, and people might comment when we might go, oh yeah, I was kind of thinking of that, which often happens. And that's why we want to put out a series of talks, because we're hoping that over time, all that collective sort of knowledge is being disseminated and shared. Absolutely. So,
and I think, as you're saying that, like one thing that's sitting there for me is like, realizing I've talked about my background coming into therapy and counselling, but not so much about the grief and loss stuff and the influence of personal experience and all of that. But it feels like that's not the totality of my interest. Like, it's a big part of my interest these days. But it's nice to be able to have the conversation today and talk about more broadly working in this space and how we came to this sort of work. Is really...
Yeah, like, I don't want to sit here and talk about my music therapy and all the nuts and bolts of that. This is more of a space between me and you that is about that focusing, or that sort of mind-body connection, and what's happening. And just other therapy things that come up in therapy, I suppose. And I think I want to just mention that as we start to come to a close to this talk, is that in the next few weeks we've already planned our topic, which has been something that I've found comes up in my personal space quite a lot when I'm talking to friends, even social gatherings and things. People often ask, well, how do you find a therapist?
Yes.
And why do I need a therapist? And I think that these are big questions for the general population that I've kind of looked online or looked to different spaces and not really found anyone really has put anything out there for people to help people make these decisions, which I think are really important. If I would have, I think in my personal experience, I've come to therapy just accidentally, and I haven't really searched it out in many instances. So I think we've talked about kind of going through a 3-part series of talking about if you need a therapist, how we go about finding a therapist, like the questions you might ask yourself, and some providing some reflective space for people to kind of consider what their options might be, or what might be more or less appropriate in certain situations.
And like, I agree, and I know we talked about this, that topic being quite important, that actually giving some time and space to that idea of how do you arrive or come to the idea of knowing you need a therapist, and then how do you find a therapist, all of that. And I imagine there'll be some parallels, I'm thinking, even with what we've talked about today, of how we came to be therapists.
That's right.
There's often a bit of a meandering road that will get you to the point where you find a counsellor or a therapist that works for you. It's not always that straightforward journey. So it won't be just hints and tips. It'll be a bit more of a broader conversation around that.
And as I said, sort of that reflective space. And I think for another conversation we wanted to have was just about what you do. So it actually do delve into that grief and trauma support that you provide. What do I do as a music therapist? And sort of give a picture of what that's like, so that people can hear a little bit about what those therapeutic spaces are like, and us doing them, because we know that every therapist in those different spaces will have their own backgrounds and methods and experiences to draw from. So I'm really excited that we've kicked off the series Conversations from the Yellow Chair with introductions of myself and yourself, Greg, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise, it's been really good, and I've noticed myself sort of relaxing as we've gone on, so it's good.
It is good. I think that we might bring it to a close there. And we'll wait for you to join us again. So support us by listening and sharing. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.